It begins with a red glow in the dark, a color so familiar it feels like memory itself. For over a century, Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink, it was a promise. A symbol of joy, youth, and the comforting idea that some things in life were too iconic to ever fade. But behind that glossy smile, something quietly cracked. The brand that once sold optimism now struggles with declining relevance, falling sales, shrinking trust, a new generation that sees sugar not as happiness, but as harm. How does a $250 billion giant lose its winning formula? How does the world's most famous beverage become a lesson in complacency and illusion? Look around, a marketplace filled with alternatives, consumers walking away from sweetness, and a company still clinging to the past, convinced its magic is eternal. What went wrong? And what does that say about us? Because Coca-Cola's decline isn't just corporate, it's cultural. It reflects a world shifting values, questioning old symbols, and waking up from a century-long dream of endless growth. And so, the story moves back, toward its origins, toward the hopeful spark that started it all, and toward the long road that transformed a simple curiosity into a global empire whose shine now feels strangely dimmer. It's almost strange to imagine Coca-Cola before it became a monument, before the red trucks, the billboards, the global glow. Long before it was an empire, it was simply an idea born in a small Atlanta pharmacy in 1886, where John Pemberton mixed a dark syrup, hoping to create something uplifting in a world still trying to recover. There was no grand ambition yet, no corporate engine humming behind the counter. Just curiosity and a fragile kind of optimism. The drink was served for a few cents at a soda fountain, not as part of a strategy, but because it genuinely fascinated people. A taste that felt new, almost daring, in a society caught between old traditions and a rapidly modernizing world. Those early days carried an innocence, a dream phase where nothing was corrupted and everything felt possible. Coca-Cola wasn't selling lifestyle or identity. It was offering refreshment and brief moments of comfort, craft, wonder, simplicity. Those were the values people tasted, long before marketing departments tried to define them. But as America expanded, Coca-Cola expanded with it. What began as a few glasses poured over a wooden counter started spreading far beyond Atlanta. Word traveled, curiosity grew, and the drink slowly became more than a local novelty. There was something in that early formula, something mysteriously sweet and forward-looking, that made it feel like a small glimpse of the future. Even in those modest beginnings, the seed of a legend had already taken root, quietly, but unmistakably. As the 20th century unfolded, that small seed began to grow with astonishing speed. Coca-Cola didn't just ride the wave of America's rise. It became part of the wave itself. Railroads stretched across states, cities swelled with new life, and Coca-Cola bottles appeared in places that once felt impossibly far from Atlanta. The company understood something powerful. People weren't just buying flavor, they were buying feeling. And that feeling could travel. Factories scaled up, bottlers multiplied, and soon the drink was crossing oceans, carried by soldiers, merchants, and dreamers chasing new beginnings. For many Americans abroad, a cold Coca-Cola became a reminder of home. For the people discovering it for the first time, it felt like a taste of a modern world arriving at their doorstep. The brand didn't just grow, it embedded itself into culture, woven into summers, celebrations, and wartime memories. Advertising amplified the momentum. Smiling faces, festive colors, promises of happiness in every sip. It was simple, yet effective, because it matched the spirit of a century obsessed with speed, expansion, and optimism. Coca-Cola became a universal symbol, a shared ritual that transcended borders and languages. By mid-century, its golden age had fully arrived. The red logo wasn't just recognized, it was trusted, admired, almost mythic. For a time, it seemed impossible to imagine a world where Coca-Cola wasn't on top, glowing as brightly as the future it promised. Yet somewhere along this rise, almost too gradually to notice, something in the company's heartbeat began to change. Growth had once been a natural consequence of the brand's magic, but now growth itself became the mission. Coca-Cola was no longer expanding with the world. It was chasing expansion for expansion's sake, quarter after quarter, chart after chart. The dream that once spread through stories and shared moments shifted into a machine driven by numbers, forecasts, and fear of slowing down. Inside boardrooms, the language changed. Words like efficiency, market penetration, and margin optimization replaced the earlier talk of craft and connection. Decisions were no longer measured by how they made people feel, but by how they played in investor reports. And then came the infamous misstep, New Coke. A decision born not from imagination, but from panic and data obsession, as if the formula could be manipulated the same way a spreadsheet could. It wasn't the product launch that turned people away. It was the realization behind it. Coca-Cola seemed to have forgotten what made it iconic. The company wasn't listening to its customers anymore. It was listening to its own projections, its own anxieties, its own relentless chase for more. The change was subtle, but over time, it created a widening gap between the brand people loved and the corporation that managed it. A gap that would soon have consequences no one could ignore. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They crept in like a slow fog. For decades, Coca-Cola lived with the assumption that demand was infinite, that the world would always reach for something sweet, cold, and familiar. But as the new century unfolded, the numbers began to tell a different story. Soda consumption in key markets slipped, first by fractions of a percent, then by noticeable drops. Health concerns grew louder. Parents who once filled their fridges with red cans hesitated, weighing nostalgia against rising awareness. In some regions, per capita consumption fell by liters within a few years. And every small decline, every fraction of a percent, sent tremors through a company calibrated for constant growth. Behind the scenes, tension grew. Investors grew impatient. Executives tightened budgets. Bottling operations felt the pressure as production targets became harder to meet. What looked like minor fluctuations on a chart translated into layoffs, restructurings, shrinking bonuses, and a sense of unease spreading across every level of the organization. Because every number carries a human shadow, a plant worker uncertain about his hours, a distributor losing shelf space, a family-run kiosk watching customers choose water instead. The crisis wasn't just financial, it was emotional. A quiet recognition that the world Coca-Cola once knew was slipping away. If the numbers revealed the cracks, the people behind them felt the impact far more personally. On factory floors, in small offices, in delivery trucks, rattling over familiar routes. This was where the decline stopped being theoretical and started becoming real. The brand that once symbolized stability now carried a quiet sense of unease. Miguel, a bottling line operator in Mexico, had spent nearly 20 years mastering the rhythm of his work, the clink of glass, the steady hum of machines. But when demand slipped, his hours were reduced, not dramatically, but enough to unsettle the life he'd built. The paycheck that once felt secure now brought a thin layer of anxiety. In Manila, Lena ran a tiny convenience stand. Coca-Cola had always been her easiest sale, something people reached for without thinking. Yet as customers shifted toward water and tea, her red crates stayed full longer. Each unsold bottle signaled a change she could no longer ignore. And in Atlanta, a salesman named Carl drove his regional route with a heaviness he couldn't shake. Retailers who once treated Coke as automatic now questioned their orders, trimmed shelf space, or prioritized newer, healthier brands. What he felt wasn't just professional loss, but a kind of emotional disorientation, like watching a lifelong certainty fade in slow motion. These stories rarely make headlines, but they echo behind every falling percentage point, reminding us that numbers always have faces. As these personal struggles unfolded, deeper questions emerged, questions that stretched far beyond the company. What happens when a brand built on shared moments becomes governed almost entirely by profit metrics? When a symbol that once represented connection turns into a machine defined by efficiency, targets, and shareholder pressure? Coca-Cola's story mirrors more than a corporate shift. It reflects a wider societal drift. For generations, the brand meant community. Families gathering, friends sharing a break, strangers finding common ground. But when the logic of infinite growth takes over, those human values erode. Decisions grow colder. The voices closest to the ground grow faint. And the people who kept the system alive begin to feel invisible. Communities once thriving around bottling plants watch them shrink or close, leaving behind economic wounds no marketing slogan could heal. Small vendors found themselves trapped between nostalgia and survival. Consumers realized the brand they trusted no longer listened to them, but to its own financial anxieties. It forces uncomfortable questions. What remains when a cultural symbol loses the warmth that made it matter? What does a society sacrifice when everything is measured in margins and market share? Coca-Cola's decline isn't only about taste. It's about a moral and cultural imbalance, a sign of what happens when meaning is traded away for momentum. Looking back, Coca-Cola's decline wasn't born from a single catastrophic mistake, but from a long chain of small decisions pushing in the same direction. Bit by bit, the company drifted from the instincts that once guided it. It began believing that brand strength alone could defy a changing world, that loyalty was permanent, that its formula for success was timeless. Short-term thinking became routine. Quarterly results overshadowed long-term vision. Instead of embracing the shift toward healthier choices early, when it could have led, the company clung to its core product, afraid that change meant betrayal. Innovation slowed, arriving late, and feeling reactive rather than visionary. And with each delay, the gap between Coca-Cola and modern consumers widened. In the boardroom, numbers took on near religious authority. Spreadsheets became the lens through which every decision passed. But cost-cutting and promotions only masked deeper issues. A brand losing cultural relevance. A product tied to outdated habits. A system valuing predictability over reinvention. What emerged was a hollow facade, the appearance of strength, supported by routines that no longer matched reality. Coca-Cola still looked powerful from the outside, but internally, the mechanisms were stiff, cautious, aging. A company built on emotion, relying increasingly on data, struggling to keep pace with a world it once helped shape. As the cracks widened, Coca-Cola began to resemble something bigger than a struggling company. It became a symbol for the limits of old economic dreams, the belief that bigger is always better, that cultural dominance is permanent, that global sameness is a virtue. For decades, Coca-Cola had represented American optimism, modernity, the promise of simple enjoyment. Opening a bottle wasn't just refreshment, it was participation in a shared cultural story. But symbols evolve with the world around them, and as global values shifted toward health, authenticity, sustainability, and individuality, Coca-Cola's image began to feel like a relic of another era. The red label that once signaled the future now evoked nostalgia, a reminder of a world moving faster than the brand could adapt. And in this way, Coca-Cola became a metaphor for the fading authority of mass consumerism. People no longer wanted one product for everyone. They wanted choice, identity, transparency. Coca-Cola, once the champion of global sameness, suddenly felt out of step in a world defined by difference. Its story reveals an unsettling truth. Even the most iconic symbols can lose meaning when the culture around them shifts. And when a company clings too tightly to its past, it risks becoming a monument instead of a participant in the present. And so the story returns to the people, the workers, vendors, families, and everyday consumers who gave Coca-Cola its power long before it became a corporate institution. They stocked the shelves, loaded the trucks, poured the drinks, and carried the brand across borders. Yet, they were often the first to feel the impact when the symbol faltered. Across factories and neighborhoods, a question echoed. Was it fair that those who sustained the brand for generations now bore the weight of distant decisions? What responsibility does a company owe to the people who built its legacy, not through strategy, but through labor, routine, and loyalty? The future remains uncertain. Coca-Cola still has resources, recognition, and the lingering glow of its myth. But recovering its soul will require far more than new flavors or shiny campaigns. It demands a shift in values. Listening sincerely, innovating with intention, choosing long-term trust over short-term wins, and rebuilding a relationship with the people who once believed in the brand without hesitation. A logo can survive almost anything. Meaning cannot. It must be earned again and again. And if Coca-Cola hopes to reclaim the space it once held, not just on shelves, but in culture, it will need to rediscover why the world cared in the first place. Coca-Cola still stands, its lights glowing, its colors vibrant, its logo unchanged. But beneath the brightness lies a symbol searching for meaning, suspended between what it once represented and what it might become. And maybe that's the real question. What is success when the story behind it begins to fade? What happens to a dream when the world that believed in it moves on? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is Coca-Cola's decline inevitable, or can a brand this iconic find its soul again? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you're interested in more deep dive stories about the systems, symbols, and illusions shaping our world, feel free to explore the other videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.